Think you know everything about the classic Western Shane? From Alan Ladd firing with his eyes closed to a dog trainer buried alive during filming, this 1953 masterpiece hides bizarre secrets that make its behind-the-scenes story almost as wild as the frontier itself. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Shane. Fact 1. The author called Alan Ladd that runt. When Jack Schaefer sat down to watch the 1953 film adaptation of his beloved novel Shane, he had very specific expectations about how his mysterious gunfighter should look and feel on screen. Schaefer had spent years crafting the character of Shane as what he later described as a dark, deadly person. Someone who would cast a long shadow across the Wyoming landscape and embody the dangerous mystique of the American frontier. So when a reporter asked the author if he had enjoyed seeing his creation brought to life in Hollywood, Schaefer's response was brutally honest and surprisingly blunt. "Yeah, I did, all except for that runt," Schaefer replied, referring directly to Alan Ladd, who stood just 5 feet 6 inches tall. The comment revealed a deep disappointment that went far beyond simple height concerns. Schaefer had originally envisioned his Shane character being played by George Raft, a much taller actor known for his genuinely menacing screen presence in crime films. Raft had the kind of dark, intimidating quality that Schaefer felt was essential to the character's appeal and believability. The author's criticism wasn't just about physical stature, though Ladd's compact frame certainly didn't match the imposing figure Schaefer had imagined riding across the plains. In a 1989 interview at Oberlin College, where he was receiving an honorary doctorate, Schaefer expanded on his feelings about the casting choice. He explained that his Shane was supposed to be someone genuinely frightening, a man whose violent past would be written across his face, and whose very presence would make decent people nervous. Instead, Alan Ladd brought a much softer, more sympathetic interpretation to the role. While Ladd's performance became iconic and helped make the film a classic, it represented a fundamental departure from Schaefer's original vision. The author's runt comment became one of the most famous examples of a writer publicly rejecting Hollywood's interpretation of their work, showing how differently creators and filmmakers can envision the same character. Fact 2. A dog trainer was nearly buried alive. One of the most bizarrely dangerous moments during the filming of Shane happened during what should have been a simple funeral scene, when director George Stevens' pursuit of the perfect shot nearly resulted in a crew member being accidentally buried alive. The scene required a dog to look mournfully into an open grave, which sounds straightforward enough until you consider that dogs don't naturally understand the concept of acting sad on command. Stevens had been trying for multiple takes to get the dog to look down into the grave with the appropriate somber expression, but the animal consistently refused to cooperate and kept looking everywhere except where the cameras needed it to look. Frustrated by the repeated failed attempts and determined to capture the emotional moment he envisioned, Stevens came up with what seemed like a creative solution to the problem. He instructed the dog's trainer to climb down into the bottom of the 6-foot-deep grave and lie there quietly, knowing that the dog would naturally look down toward its familiar handler. The plan worked perfectly at first, with the dog finally gazing down into the grave exactly as Stevens wanted while the trainer remained hidden at the bottom of the hole. The crew then lowered a coffin that had been loaded with rocks to give it the proper weight and realistic appearance for the scene. Everything was proceeding smoothly until one of the musicians on set, a harmonica player, was so moved by the solemnity of the moment that he spontaneously began playing the melancholy tune, Dixie. The haunting music created such a powerful atmosphere that it affected the entire crew, who became genuinely emotional watching the scene unfold. In their absorption with the moment, several crew members automatically began shoveling dirt into the grave as part of the burial sequence, completely forgetting that a living person was still lying at the bottom. Fortunately, someone quickly remembered the trainer's presence before any serious harm was done, but the incident became one of the most talked about near disasters in the film's production history. Fact 3. Alan Ladd shot with his eyes closed. Alan Ladd's portrayal of Shane as a cool, confident gunfighter was so convincing that audiences never suspected the actor was actually terrified of firearms and frequently fired weapons with his eyes tightly shut. This fear created one of the most ironic situations in Hollywood history, where an actor famous for playing tough guys with guns was genuinely afraid of the very props that made him a star. Ladd's gun phobia became particularly obvious during one of the film's most memorable scenes, where Shane demonstrates his shooting skills to young Joey Starrett in the family's backyard. In this pivotal moment, Shane shows the boy how to handle a revolver and fires several shots to display his expertise with the weapon. The scene was meant to establish Shane's credibility as a dangerous man, while also showing his willingness to share knowledge with the boy who idolizes him. However, anyone who watches this scene carefully can clearly see that Ladd has his eyes closed while pulling the trigger, completely contradicting the image of a seasoned gunslinger who should be comfortable and confident with firearms. The closed eyes are especially noticeable because the camera focuses directly on Ladd's face during the shooting, making his discomfort impossible to hide from viewers who know what to look for. This wasn't just a one-time occurrence during filming. Throughout the production, Ladd consistently displayed his discomfort with guns, and his aim was notoriously poor as a result of his fear. In later action scenes, particularly during the climactic saloon shootout, careful examination reveals that Ladd's pistol is often pointed well away from his supposed targets, especially during the final confrontation where Shane kills Riker's brother. The irony becomes even more pronounced when you consider that Ladd built much of his career playing characters who were supposed to be deadly with weapons. His breakthrough role had been as a cold-blooded hitman in This Gun for Hire, and he continued playing similar tough guy roles throughout the 1940s and early 1950s, all while harboring this genuine fear of the very tools that defined his screen persona. Fact 4. Jack Palance couldn't mount his horse. Jack Palance's intimidating presence as the villainous gunfighter Jack Wilson in Shane was so convincing that audiences never suspected he was actually nervous around horses and had tremendous difficulty with the basic skill of Tremontaine, mounting and dismounting. This problem created significant challenges during filming, since Wilson was supposed to be a seasoned cowboy who would naturally be comfortable on horseback. Before filming began, Palance was primarily known as a theater actor who had very little experience with horses or guns, having spent most of his career performing on Broadway stages rather than Western movie sets. When he arrived in Wyoming for the Shane production, his inexperience with horses immediately became apparent to director George Stevens and the crew, causing delays as they tried to work around his limitations. The most problematic scene involved Wilson's introduction at the Starrett Ranch, where Palance was supposed to dismount from his horse for a tense face-off with Shane, then remount and ride away in a display of casual confidence. After numerous failed attempts to get back on his horse smoothly, Palance finally managed to execute one perfect dismount that looked natural and menacing on camera. Stevens, recognizing that this might be their only usable take, decided to film Palance's dismount in slow motion and then run the footage in reverse to create the illusion of a smooth, effortless mount. This clever camera trick solved the immediate problem, but Palance's overall riding skills remained so awkward that Stevens had to completely rethink how the character would be introduced to audiences. The original plan called for Wilson to make a dramatic entrance by galloping into town at full speed, which would have established him as a skilled horseman and dangerous opponent. However, Palance looked so uncomfortable and unsteady while riding at any significant pace that Stevens was forced to change the scene entirely. Instead of the planned galloping entrance, Stevens filmed Wilson riding into town at a slow, deliberate walk. This change actually enhanced the character's menacing presence, as the measured, unhurried pace suggested a man so confident in his abilities that he didn't need to make flashy displays of horsemanship to intimidate his enemies. Fact 5. One scene required 119 takes. What should have been a straightforward scene of Shane demonstrating his shooting skills to young Joey became one of the most grueling experiences in the entire production, requiring an astounding 119 takes before director George Stevens was satisfied with the result. This seemingly simple moment, where Shane fires his revolver to show Joey his expertise with firearms, turned into a marathon filming session that tested everyone's patience and endurance. The scene was crucial to the story because it establishes Shane's credibility as a dangerous gunfighter, while also showing his growing bond with the boy who idolizes him. Stevens envisioned this moment as a key character development scene that would demonstrate both Shane's skill and his willingness to share knowledge with Joey, making it essential that every detail look perfect on screen. However, the combination of Alan Ladd's well-documented fear of firearms and Stevens' notorious perfectionism created a perfect storm of production difficulties. Ladd's discomfort with guns meant that many takes were ruined by his obvious nervousness, closed eyes, or poor handling of the weapon, while Stevens' exacting standards meant that even technically acceptable takes were rejected if they didn't meet his precise vision for how the scene should look and feel. Stevens was known throughout Hollywood as a meticulous director who would shoot scenes dozens of times to achieve exactly what he wanted. But even by his standards, 119 takes was excessive. The crew members who witnessed this marathon filming session later described it as both exhausting and somewhat absurd, as they watched the same brief interaction play out over and over again, with only minor variations. Each failed take meant resetting the cameras, adjusting lighting, reloading the prop gun with blanks, and having Ladd and young Brandon DeWilde return to their starting positions to try again. The process consumed an entire day of production time and significant resources, all for a scene that lasts less than 2 minutes in the final film, demonstrating just how demanding Stevens could be when pursuing his artistic vision. Fact 6. The movie was nearly sold to Howard Hughes. What was supposed to be a straightforward Western production became such an expensive nightmare for Paramount Pictures that studio executives seriously considered selling the entire project to billionaire filmmaker Howard Hughes, who was known for his willingness to spend enormous amounts of money on movies that other studios couldn't afford to complete. The film's budget had spiraled completely out of control due to George Stevens' perfectionist approach to filmmaking and his extended shooting schedule. Shane was originally planned as a modest B picture that would be produced quickly and inexpensively, following the standard formula for Western films of the early 1950s. However, Stevens' meticulous attention to detail and his insistence on shooting multiple takes of every scene caused the production costs to climb far beyond what Paramount had budgeted for the project. The studio executives watched nervously as expenses mounted week after week with no clear end in sight. When the costs reached a point where Paramount executives feared the film might never recoup its investment, they approached Howard Hughes to see if he might be interested in taking over the production. Hughes was famous in Hollywood for his deep pockets and his willingness to finance expensive projects that other studios considered too risky, making him a logical choice for rescuing Shane from financial disaster. Initially, Hughes declined the offer, apparently not seeing enough potential in the project to justify the significant investment that would be required to complete it. However, the situation changed dramatically when Hughes was given the opportunity to view a rough cut of the footage that Stevens had already completed. After watching the unfinished film, Hughes immediately recognized the quality of what Stevens was creating and completely reversed his position. Hughes offered to purchase the film outright from Paramount, recognizing that despite the inflated costs, Shane had the potential to be something special. This sudden change of heart from someone as shrewd as Hughes convinced Paramount executives that they might actually have a valuable property on their hands, leading them to reconsider their strategy and ultimately decide to keep the film and release it as one of their major productions for 1953. Fact 7. Brandon DeWilde was a scene-stealing troublemaker. The film's most emotional and memorable scene, where the wounded Shane explains to young Joey why he must leave and can never return, became a comedy of errors behind the cameras, thanks to 11-year-old Brandon DeWilde's mischievous behavior during what was supposed to be a deeply moving moment. This farewell scene was crucial to the entire film, as it provided the emotional climax where Shane delivers his famous speech about how there's no living with a killing before riding away forever. Director George Stevens had worked carefully to create the perfect atmosphere for this pivotal moment, with the entire cast and crew understanding the importance of capturing the scene's emotional weight. Alan Ladd was prepared to deliver one of his most heartfelt performances, speaking directly to the boy who had idolized him throughout the story, while the cameras rolled to capture what everyone knew would be one of the film's defining moments. However, every time Ladd began delivering his emotional farewell lines, young DeWilde would wait until he was sure the cameras were focused on him, then cross his eyes and stick out his tongue directly at his co-star. This childish behavior completely broke the serious mood of the scene and caused Ladd to break character and start laughing, ruining take after take of what was supposed to be a deeply serious dramatic moment. The pattern continued through multiple attempts, with DeWilde apparently finding it hilarious to disrupt the adult actor's concentration at the most crucial moments. While the crew initially found the boy's antics amusing, the repeated delays began to frustrate everyone involved, especially Ladd, who was struggling to maintain the emotional intensity required for the scene while dealing with a giggling child making faces at him. Finally, after numerous ruined takes, Ladd reached his breaking point and called out to DeWilde's father, who was present on set. "Make that kid stop or I'll beat him over the head with a brick." The threat was clearly made in jest, but it got the message across, and DeWilde finally behaved himself long enough for Stevens to capture the powerful farewell scene that audiences remember today. Fact 8. The film debuted widescreen by accident. Shane became the first film to showcase Paramount Pictures' new widescreen technology, not because George Stevens had planned it that way, but purely by coincidence, due to how the movie happened to be filmed using mostly long and medium shots that could survive the cropping process. This accidental debut of widescreen cinema occurred because Paramount executives were desperately looking for a suitable film to demonstrate their new projection system, and Shane just happened to be the right fit. During the early 1950s, Hollywood studios were frantically developing widescreen formats to compete with the growing popularity of television, which was keeping audiences away from movie theaters. Paramount had invested heavily in developing their new 1.66:1 aspect ratio system, but they needed the perfect film to debut this technology and prove its value to theater owners and moviegoers. The problem was that most films of that era were shot using the standard 1.37:1 Academy ratio, which meant that converting them to widescreen would require cropping the top and bottom of the image. This cropping often ruined carefully composed shots by cutting off actors' heads or important visual elements, making most existing films unsuitable for widescreen presentation. When Paramount executives reviewed Shane, they discovered that Stevens had coincidentally shot most of the film using wide establishing shots and medium shots that showed the expansive Wyoming landscape. These compositions meant that cropping the top and bottom of the image wouldn't destroy the visual integrity of the scenes, since the important action and characters were positioned in the center portion of the frame that would remain visible in widescreen format. For the film's premiere at Radio City Music Hall, Paramount replaced the theater's standard 34 by 25-foot screen with a massive 50-foot wide by 30-foot high screen to showcase the new format. The studio also created a new 3-track stereophonic soundtrack to accompany the widescreen presentation, turning Shane into a full demonstration of Paramount's technological capabilities. This successful debut convinced the studio to produce all subsequent films in the new widescreen ratio until 1954, when they switched to an even wider 1.85:1 format. Fact 9. Cattle were imported because local ones looked too healthy. George Stevens' obsession with creating an authentic frontier atmosphere extended to every detail visible on screen, including his decision to import cattle from distant locations because the local Wyoming herds looked too prosperous and well-fed for the harsh 1880s setting he was trying to portray. This attention to livestock authenticity demonstrates just how far Stevens was willing to go to ensure that every element of Shane looked historically accurate. The story of Shane takes place during a time when cattle ranching was a difficult and often brutal business, with animals facing harsh weather conditions, limited food sources, and the constant challenges of frontier life. Stevens wanted the cattle in his film to reflect these realities by appearing lean, weathered, and appropriately roughened by the demanding environment of the Wyoming territory. However, when the production crew scouted the Jackson Hole area where they planned to film, they discovered that the local cattle herds were far too healthy and well-maintained to convincingly represent 19th-century frontier livestock. The Wyoming ranchers of the 1950s had access to modern veterinary care, improved feed, and better ranching techniques, which meant their cattle looked sleek, well-fed, and obviously cared for in ways that would have been impossible during the time period depicted in the film. Rather than compromise his vision or simply hope that audiences wouldn't notice the discrepancy, Stevens made the expensive decision to import cattle from other regions where the animals would better match his requirements for authenticity. This process involved significant logistical challenges and additional costs, as the production had to arrange for transporting, housing, and caring for the imported livestock throughout the filming period. Stevens applied this same level of meticulous attention to numerous other aspects of the production, ensuring that building construction matched 1880s specifications, costumes were historically accurate down to the smallest details, and even the smallest props reflected the proper time period. This commitment to authenticity was part of what made Shane stand out from other westerns of its era, but it also contributed significantly to the production's escalating costs and extended shooting schedule. Fact 10. Gunshot sounds were made with garbage cans. George Stevens wanted the gunshots in Shane to have a shocking, powerful impact that would startle audiences and emphasize the deadly seriousness of firearms, so he developed an unusual sound effect technique that involved firing weapons directly into garbage cans to create echoing, cannon-like reverberations. This innovative approach to sound design was part of Stevens' broader mission to show audiences what he called the horrors of violence, rather than glorifying gunfights as exciting entertainment. Stevens had served as head of the Signal Corps Special Motion Picture Unit during World War II, where he filmed some of the most horrific scenes of the war, including the D-Day landings and the liberation of concentration camps at Dachau and Nordhausen. These experiences had given him a deep understanding of the true destructive power of weapons and a determination to portray violence realistically rather than romantically. The director specifically wanted the first gunshots in Shane to have maximum impact on viewers, since they occurred during the scene where Shane demonstrates his shooting skills to young Joey. Stevens believed that if he could make audiences genuinely startled by the sound of gunfire, they would better understand the serious nature of the weapons and the violence that was to come later in the film. To achieve this effect, the sound crew fired large-caliber weapons into metal garbage cans, which created loud, echoing reverberations that were much more dramatic and attention-grabbing than the standard gunshot sounds used in most Western films of that era. The metal containers amplified and distorted the sound in ways that made the gunshots seem more powerful and threatening than they would have sounded with conventional recording techniques. This technique was groundbreaking for its time and influenced later filmmakers who wanted to create more realistic and impactful sound effects for violent scenes. The enhanced gunshot sounds in Shane helped establish a new standard for how weapons should sound in movies, moving away from the relatively quiet, sanitized gunshots that had been common in earlier westerns toward more authentic and disturbing audio that reflected the true danger of firearms. Fact 11. The film was shot in 1951, but released in 1953. George Stevens' obsessive editing process was so extensive that despite completing principal photography in October 1951, the movie wasn't released until 1953, with Stevens spending nearly 2 years perfecting every cut and detail of the film. This extraordinarily long post-production period was virtually unheard of in Hollywood at the time, when most films were edited and released within months of completing filming. Stevens was notorious throughout the industry for his perfectionist approach to filmmaking, but even by his exacting standards, the editing process for Shane was unusually prolonged and meticulous. The director had shot an enormous amount of footage during production, giving himself multiple angles and takes for virtually every scene in the film, which meant that the editing room was filled with countless hours of material that needed to be carefully reviewed and assembled. The extended editing period wasn't simply a matter of Stevens being slow or indecisive, but rather reflected his determination to craft every moment of the film with precision and care. He spent months reviewing different combinations of shots, experimenting with various pacing options, and fine-tuning the emotional rhythms of individual scenes to achieve exactly the effect he wanted. This prolonged post-production schedule created significant problems for Paramount Pictures, which had expected to release Shane much earlier and was watching production costs continue to mount even after filming had wrapped. The studio executives grew increasingly nervous as months passed without a finished film, especially since they were paying interest on their investment and missing potential release windows. However, Stevens' patience and perfectionism ultimately paid off, as the extra time he spent in the editing room allowed him to create a film that was far more polished and emotionally effective than it would have been with a rushed post-production schedule. The careful attention to pacing, character development, and visual composition that resulted from this extended editing process was a major factor in Shane's eventual success and lasting reputation as one of the finest westerns ever made. Fact 12. A stunt double did Shane's fancy gun twirling. The impressive gun spinning and twirling sequences that make Shane look like a master gunfighter during the climactic saloon showdown were actually performed by skilled stunt performer Rod Redwing, not Alan Ladd, revealing another instance where the actor's discomfort with firearms required creative solutions from the production team. This substitution was necessary because the complex gun-handling maneuvers required a level of expertise and confidence with weapons that Ladd simply couldn't provide. During the film's most dramatic confrontation, when Shane faces off against Jack Wilson and the other villains in Grafton's saloon, the character performs several elaborate gun-spinning moves that demonstrate his mastery of firearms and help establish his credibility as a deadly gunfighter. These sequences required precise timing, steady hands, and complete familiarity with the weight and balance of the revolver, skills that took years of practice to develop. However, given Alan Ladd's well-documented fear of guns and his tendency to close his eyes when firing, attempting to have him perform these intricate maneuvers would have been both dangerous and likely to produce unconvincing results. The production team recognized that audiences needed to believe Shane was genuinely skilled with weapons, which meant the gun handling had to look natural and effortless rather than nervous or clumsy. Rod Redwing was brought in specifically for these sequences because of his expertise with firearms and his ability to perform the kind of flashy gun work that would impress audiences and support the character's reputation. The filming was carefully arranged so that Redwing could perform the gun spinning while maintaining the illusion that it was actually Shane doing the work. Interestingly, this contrast becomes even more apparent when compared to the earlier scene where Shane demonstrates his shooting skills to Joey, where it's clearly Alan Ladd himself on camera, performing much simpler gun handling. For that scene, the props department provided Ladd with a different revolver that was specifically chosen because it was easier and safer for an inexperienced actor to handle, showing how the production adapted to work around the star's limitations throughout the filming process. Fact 13. Jean Arthur came out of retirement as a favor. Jean Arthur's appearance in Shane marked a remarkable return to the big screen for the 50-year-old actress, who had essentially retired from Hollywood filmmaking and only agreed to take the role of Marion Starrett as a personal favor to director George Stevens, with whom she had developed a close professional friendship during their previous collaborations. This decision made Shane not only Arthur's final major film role but also her only appearance in a color motion picture during her entire career. Arthur had been one of Hollywood's biggest stars during the 1930s and 1940s, known for her distinctive voice and her performances in screwball comedies and dramas, but by the early 1950s, she had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the pressures and demands of movie stardom. She had stepped away from regular filmmaking and was living a much quieter life, largely removed from the Hollywood scene that had made her famous. The connection between Arthur and Stevens dated back to their successful collaborations on two previous films: The Talk of the Town in 1942, where she starred alongside Cary Grant and Ronald Colman, and The More the Merrier in 1943, which earned Arthur her only Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. These experiences had created a strong working relationship and mutual respect between the actress and director. When Stevens began planning Shane, he specifically wanted Arthur for the role of Marion because he felt she could bring the right combination of strength and vulnerability to the character of the frontier wife, caught between her loyalty to her husband and her growing attraction to the mysterious Shane. However, convincing Arthur to accept the role required Stevens to make a personal appeal, emphasizing their friendship and his belief that she was perfect for the part. Arthur's decision to come out of semi-retirement for this one film proved to be the right choice, as her performance added emotional depth and authenticity to Shane. After completing the film, she essentially returned to retirement from motion pictures, making only occasional television appearances and some theater work before withdrawing from public life entirely. Fact 14. Men in bear costumes terrorized the horses. During the intense barn fight scene between Shane and Joe Starrett, George Stevens needed the horses tied up in the corral to react with genuine panic and hysteria to make the violence look more realistic and chaotic, so he came up with the unusual solution of having two crew members dress in full bear costumes and run around the animals to create authentic fear responses. This bizarre filming technique was part of Stevens' commitment to capturing realistic reactions rather than relying on trained animal behaviors that might look too controlled or artificial on screen. The fight scene was a crucial moment in the film where Shane and Joe work together to battle a group of Rikers men who have come to intimidate the homesteaders, and Stevens wanted every element of the scene to contribute to the sense of chaos and danger. The horses' reactions were particularly important because their panic would help sell the idea that a serious, violent confrontation was taking place, making the audience feel the tension and unpredictability of the situation. However, getting horses to display genuine fear and agitation on command is notoriously difficult, since these animals are typically well-trained for film work and accustomed to ignoring the noise and commotion of movie sets. Simply having people shout or make loud noises usually isn't enough to provoke the kind of dramatic reaction that Stevens wanted to capture on camera. The bear costume solution was both creative and effective, since horses have a natural, instinctive fear of bears that would trigger genuine panic responses rather than the mild annoyance or indifference that might result from other scare tactics. When the costumed crew members appeared near the corral and began moving around in a threatening manner, the horses responded with exactly the kind of wild-eyed terror that Stevens was looking for. This method required careful coordination to ensure the safety of both the animals and the actors who were fighting nearby, since genuinely panicked horses can be dangerous and unpredictable. The crew had to time the bear costume appearances precisely to capture the desired reactions while making sure that no one was injured by the frightened animals during the filming process. Fact 15. The film used hidden wires for violent deaths. George Stevens pioneered a groundbreaking special effects technique in Shane by using hidden wires to yank actors violently backward when they were shot, creating a shocking, realistic portrayal of gunshot impacts that had never been seen in movies before, and would later influence many famous films including The Godfather Part 2 and Bonnie and Clyde. This innovation was part of Stevens' broader mission to show audiences the true brutality of violence rather than the sanitized, unrealistic gunfights that were common in most westerns of the early 1950s. The technique was most dramatically demonstrated during the scenes where Jack Palance shoots Elisha Cook Jr. and when other characters are killed by gunfire throughout the film. Instead of having actors simply fall down or stumble backward in the traditional manner, Stevens had them rigged with carefully concealed wires that were attached to their bodies and connected to pulleys operated by crew members positioned out of camera range. When the moment came for a character to be shot, the crew would yank the wires with considerable force, causing the actor to be jerked backward with a violence and suddenness that genuinely shocked audiences who had never seen anything like it on screen before. This created the illusion that the bullets were actually striking the victims with tremendous physical force, making the gunshots appear far more deadly and impactful than the gentle falls that characterized most movie deaths of that era. Stevens' decision to use this technique was directly influenced by his wartime experiences as head of the Signal Corps Special Motion Picture Unit, where he had witnessed the real effects of violence and wanted to convey that harsh reality to moviegoers. He believed that by making gunshots look genuinely devastating rather than exciting or glamorous, he could help audiences understand the serious consequences of violence. The wire technique proved so effective that it became a standard method for creating realistic gunshot effects in cinema, with later filmmakers like Francis Ford Coppola and Arthur Penn adopting and refining the approach for their own violent scenes, helping to establish a new level of realism in action movies.